Hello everyone there. My name is Asmo Urpilainen and I'm the Chief Product Officer for the Frends Integration platform, meaning that I'm technically responsible for the development of the platform, how we are presenting to our customers and overseeing a whole bunch of different integration use cases over many different customers. Frends is basically a purely browser-based enterprise-grade integration platform as a service, meaning that all of the development work, monitoring, analytics, everything that you do happens in that simple, basically web application, and you don't need to have any sort of external development tools or things like that attached. And everything is just accessible and easy to use in that simple cloud service. We, of course, have a full-blown API management suite built into the Frends platform for all of your API needs. So designing APIs, managing the lifecycle of APIs, monitoring those, exposing them at various different locations in the cloud and on-premise situations, etc., etc. But of course, in addition to the APIs themselves, we implement all of our more traditional integration use cases, such as managed file transfers, data integrations to bring the data to be available at, let's say, a front-end application when it is needed, application-to-application integration. And of course, once you put all of these kind of different building blocks together, we end up with a full-blown business process automation where we can then take end-to-end processes and use these techniques and methods to pretty much provide that end-to-end pipeline for a specific use case. And of course, what we like to do is be as efficient and productive when creating these sorts of automations and integrations and APIs. And we have our quite unique own low-code approach to speed up the development of new integrations, where the ideology is pretty much that we will offer you over 250 of these kind of ready-made integration connectors or tasks. But because we've been in the business for over 30 years, we realize that not everything can be pre-built by us and anticipated by us, and that's why we need to have that code as an option there. So we combine the best of both worlds, from that ready-made existing connector base to customized solutions when those would be needed. But of course, in addition to speeding up the actual development of new integrations and automations, it's quite important, especially in more business-critical scenarios, to have everything else outside the actual development work as seamlessly and well-governed as possible. And that means that we want the platform to basically be self-documenting, so you always understand what's happening, what's going on. We should have built-in version control procedures with basically support for development, test, and production environments, and one-click deployments and releases, and all of these sorts of different sort of integration catalogs and other monitoring and let's say analytical features standardized on the platform, so that the developers and operators, business users, they don't have to worry about setting those up, and we will basically offer all of that out of the box once you just start developing. And finally, one key aspect I think of Frends nowadays is that almost all customers' kind of environments have been fractured a little bit in nowadays, meaning that you have maybe some on-premise traditional data center systems or data sources available. You might have newer applications in the cloud. You might have mobile apps working with a couple of different vendors, etc., etc., etc. And this basically means that the integration platform, which would act as the glue between all of these processes and systems, needs to be able to run in almost any type of an environment. So rather than forcing you to modify your IT environment to fit Frends, we want Frends to kind of come in there and modify itself or adapt it to your IT environment, so that then we can have the capability of running those integrations and those APIs wherever we need for that particular use case. And finally, but not least, I would say that our motto, which is kind of practicality and simplicity first. So these sorts of automations and integrations and APIs, they are not rocket science, and that anyone can actually start creating integrations using the Frends platform, and you don't need to be a specific Frends specialist in order to do something and operate the platform itself. All right, maybe moving on to a little bit of a brief introduction into what Frends is and how it works. So here we actually have basically an invoice processing example of an integration built on using Frends. And the key concepts to understand here is that we always model out all of our integration and automation use cases using this sort of a process-based approach. So there is a global standard called BPMN 2.0, Business Process Modeling Notation, and that's what's providing that visual representation of that technical workflow. And of course, we always need to have some sort of a trigger in place for the workflow. And in the case of the example here, we actually configure two different types of triggers where we could receive the invoice using a predefined API, or it could actually come in the format of a more standardized, or I would say more traditional file that just gets transferred over to an SFTP server somewhere. And that is actually then the triggering mechanism for the invoice processing. And maybe moving on to kind of how the actual process is then built is that you could actually see that we have these blue or actually white boxes with the rounded edges. Those are what we are calling now tasks, and the tasks are now there to provide you with built-in automatic functionality, such as in this case, for example, doing conversions between different types of data like invoice to JSON, or validating incoming data such as the UBL invoice in this example, reading files, interacting with systems. All of that kind of needed functionality in the integration flow is now modeled and configured using those tasks. But we can, of course, now, in addition, add in decisions to the process. We could, of course, do loops. We can, of course, have error handling in place, where, for example, in this case, if we detect that there is an, let's say, anomaly within the incoming invoice, we could actually request a business owner or the business process owner to fill in the needed details for that invoice before actually continuing to the actual processing of that invoice. And finally, there are a couple of examples there about then the low-code aspect. So where we could, for example, retrieve the latest currency conversion rate and then run a little bit of C# code to calculate the converted currency, and of course use that to then finalize the integration by sending the invoice itself to an ERP. Basically, what I'd like to go through here is a little bit of a demo and presentation on the platform itself. So where are we actually now? We are now at one of our Frends tenants or deployment environments, as we like to call them, called demo.frendsapp.com. And basically, all of our customers get a dedicated Frends environment with all dedicated components, meaning that there is no mixing and matching of data between other customer environments, and you can always be sure that your data is isolated and secure on the platform itself. And in terms of what we can find here in the Frends control panel is various different views for example, developing APIs and managing the access control policies for APIs, the versions of those APIs, and basically a full-on API management suite under the APIs tab. But most interestingly, what we are going to be looking at today is the main integration catalog or the process catalog, as you can see it here on the screen, where pretty much we always start using Frends from this view, regardless of what we are doing, because the main integration catalog here can be utilized to search and find various types of information regarding our integrations, which have been developed in our Frends here. So we could try and find, for example, integrations that are using a specific component or connecting to a specific system or utilizing a specific type of a message. And of course, we can access all sorts of governance and management functionalities relating to our integrations. So we can, of course, see the version numbers of each and every integration, and perhaps manage the logging settings for each integrations regarding monitoring. And pretty much this is the place where we, for example, start
the deployment process from the development environment to test and finally, of course, production at some point. But let's jump into creating a new integration, since that's what we are here for, and click on the Create New button, which basically takes us now to the process editor, which is now the main place where we basically do all of our development work. And the first thing that we need to do when defining or creating any type of a new integration is, of course, provide some initial information about that in the integration. So, of course, what's the name of the integration? And in this case, it could be, let's say, int001. I don't know, this could be product information update. Could be our user scenario or integration scenario as an example here. And basically, we can, of course, control the versioning of this integration. So I'm going to set the major version to be 1 and the minor version to be 0. And of course, I could maybe provide some extra documentation or description on what my integration is doing here. And of course, the first step after providing that kind of basic metadata configuration would be to create the outline for my integration. So I kind of plan my work ahead a little bit as well when utilizing this sort of a Frends development logic. So if you remember from the slides, I mentioned that we always describe the integration in this sort of a process-based approach. That's actually a really important bit or a really important piece of information to understand about Frends as well. Frends kind of forces you to work in this sort of a process-based approach. And you will see why that's a good thing in just a moment, because typically what I like to do now is before I go into any of the technical configuration, I can actually now just draw out what needs to happen by the solution. So typically I would do something like this. I would say that, all right, let's get the top, or let's say that the get top 20 products from database. So if our integration use case was something like getting a product information from our product information management system, that would be, let's say, an SQL database, and then updating that product information to, let's say, some sort of a web shop interface could be a good example. So the first step should be getting out that product information from the product information management system. And if we're getting multiple products, so in this case, we would be getting, let's say, the top 20 products, I would now have to, of course, iterate or loop through each of the products. So I want something to happen for each product. So I'll just call the loop for each product found. And now the functionality that we would like to repeat for each of the products is, of course, insert the product to a, let's say, web shop. I'm bad at typing here. Web shop API. And then we close out the loop and, of course, the integration process itself. So now we have this sort of a working frame where we can start our development work. And basically what this means is that now that we have the frame ready, we would now actually need to configure the first step, the second step, and of course the trigger mechanism for my integration here. So let's start from the first step. So if my task here now is to get the top 20 products from a database, now I would actually have to access that library of those pre-built integration functionalities that we need to basically implement that database query. And the easiest way for me to get there is simply to search through the library for example, SQL. And I can, of course, see that, hey, we found 4 different operations that are available for me to interact with an SQL database. So I'm going to pick the execute query option here today. And that now opens up the low-code configuration window where I can actually tell that microservice or tell that task what it needs to exactly do. And a good thing to note here, of course, is that all of our tasks and connectors are free and open source here on GitHub. So please go ahead and steal our connector code for your own use cases if you feel like it. But the important thing to kind of go through here is, of course, the actual configuration. So if we need to perform an SQL query and the SQL query task tells us that it wants the query itself, so the SQL query, it wants possible parameters, and then it needs to know what database it's targeting using a database connection string. So basically what we could do here at this point is directly just type out and write our SQL query. So this could be something like select top 20 star from sales lt.product. So this is just a simple Azure SQL database that has the AdventureWorks database template there if you're wondering. And of course, besides the SQL query itself, we would have to now tell the component where the database is located. And here is actually our first chance to use the low-code functionality of Frends. So what we can actually do is put in double curly brackets, which basically enable the low-code functionality in any step that we are creating here on the Frends platform. And inside the double curly brackets, we are actually allowed to add in a hashtag which allows us to create references to all sorts of data and variables that we utilize as part of the integration flow here. So in this case, what I would like to add a reference to is actually to a feature called environment variables, meaning that we have a single centralized location now to manage these sort of connection strings or API keys or endpoint addresses and things like that. And of course, at the same time, what we are able to do is provide separate values for different active environments. So depending on which environment this actually integration is running, it would be able to target the correct database depending on the configuration we provide here. So that would be the initial first step that I need to do. And of course, now that I've kind of drawn out my process, I've implemented the first step, I of course want to know, does my configuration work? So that means that we could actually create a unit test and run that particular step of the integration directly here through the browser and kind of see that, yep, this is the result that we are getting back from the database. And a good thing to know here is that internally, all data is actually processed in a JSON format by the Frends platform. And the reason for this is now that we actually are quite happy with the result of our test. So we know that we can get the top 20 products into Frends here. And now we need to simply iterate through those products and perform the webshop API call. So of course, what I would need to do then is I would need to tell my loop that I want to now loop through all of the top 20 products that I'm getting from my database query here. And I want to access each product under a variable of product from within the loop. And finally, of course, we just need to do exactly what we did here for the execute query, but instead of targeting an SQL database, we might, let's say, perform a REST request and select the REST request connector with the link to the open source documentation as usual. And of course, the configuration looks slightly similar, but it's of course a little bit different since now we are working on the HTTP protocol instead of the SQL protocol. And of course, what I would need to do here, I could say that, yes, let's do a post. And let's say we want to send the message to this sort of a testing service called http-bin.org, which is pretty much just this sort of a common testing, service available in the internet that just echoes back whatever we send there. Because the interesting bit comes next. So now that we have our product data here, and I know that I can loop through each product, and I would like to send an update message with that product information to that http-bin.org service. What I could basically do is I could, for example, specify that the message I'm sending is XML. And let's say that our XML has a product element, which has an ID element in it. Let's say we could have a color element. And finally, we could also have, let's say, size. So basically, and finally, we could also have something like, let's say, a date timestamp of the message that we are actually creating. So now what's left for us to do is provide just the low-code configuration, so the mapping So Frends knows which column or which attribute basically to pick into each field. And we do this in exactly the same way as we provided the connection string in the first step. So we put in those double curly brackets to enable the low-code functionality, access the variables through hashtag, and under now result instead of the environment variables, we could actually now target the get top 20 products from the database, which could allow us to now directly pick up information from here, or we could actually now access the variable product, which we defined in the loop here earlier. And of course, now what's left for me to do is simply just say that, yes, the ID is now coming from the product ID. The color is coming from, of course, color. So let's just copy that there and that there. So the color is coming from the color column, and size could maybe be just the size column like that. And just to make things interesting, we could, of course, also run any C# and .NET code directly within the double curly brackets as well. So I could do something like, let's say, write a little bit of a snippet here saying datetime.now.toString, and let's say I could grab the current date timestamp in a specific format here for my product. And also what we are allowed to do, of course, is any type of a data manipulation that C# and .NET allow us to do. So I could, for example, say stuff like, all right, so let's take the color first as a text or string, and now that it's in a textual format, let's replace the large capital G with an exclamation mark for whatever reason, if we wanted to have this sort of a data manipulation in place. And of course, the last thing that we would perhaps like to do on our integration here is say that, all right, now that we've successfully processed each of the products, I actually want to grab the product ID and actually send the product ID out from the integration as this sort of a variable or a promoted, let's say, monitoring variable, meaning that now we actually can search the executions using that product ID because we're spitting it out from the integration process.